Well, hello, everyone. Peter Maravellis here on behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers and the City Lights Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to another installment of City Lights Live, the virtual extension of the City Lights events calendar. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ohlone peoples, aka the San Francisco Bay Area. We would like to take this moment to offer our respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Tonight, we are delighted to have with us Paul S. Hirsch discussing his new book, Pulp Empire, The Secret History of Comic Book Imperialism. It's published by the University of Chicago Press, and it is the winner of the Popular Cultural Association's Ray and Pat Browne Award for Best Book in Popular American Culture. Pulp Empire tells the hitherto little-known story of how the U.S. government both attacked and appropriated comic books to help wage World War II and the Cold War, also to promote official and clandestine foreign policy, and launched efforts to deflect global critiques of American racism. Government agencies work directly with comic book publishers to fan hatred for their enemies while simultaneously attempting to dispel racial tensions at home. Dr. Hirsch's groundbreaking research weaves together a wealth of previously classified material, including secret wartime records, official legislative documents, and caches of personal papers, which make this a very compelling work indeed, and one that excites us here at City Lights. Paul S. Hirsch is a visiting research affiliate at the Institute for Historical Studies in the Department of History at the University of Texas in Austin, and is also an advocate for citizens with physical disabilities. He is a frequent guest on National Public Radio and podcasts like Marvel's Declassified and Backstory. He is the author of the book Funny Man, The Tragic Adventures of a Crime-Fighting Comedian, which has won awards from the American Historical Association and the Robert B. Silvers Foundation. He is currently working on a book titled The Accidental Killer, The Man Who Destroyed the World, and he is also working on a novel titled Meat on a Hook, based upon his own remarkable experiences as a disabled person. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Dr. Paul Hirsch. Pleasure to have you with us. Welcome to City Lights.
Thanks. This is a privilege. Peter, thank you so much. And when I say it's a privilege, I mean it. Like a million other American kids, my exposure to poetry began with a pocket poetry edition of Howl that I bought at City Lights. And it means the world to be here right now. You played a big part in the arc of my life, and I'm grateful. So thank you. I'm going to read a bit from Pulp Empire, but predominantly speak. And then I'll close with some more from the book. And I really hope that you're willing to ask me some questions at the end. I feel like that's when we get down to the nitty-gritty and when we discover the most interesting stuff about my research and the book. So please don't be shy at the end. It would mean a lot to me if you ask some questions. But to begin with, I'm going to read just a little from the intro to explain how I got into this book. When I was 10 years old, a comic book shop owner, threatened me with a gun, and it thrilled me. In the mid-1980s, reading and collecting comic books was deeply uncool. Interactions with adults made clear that they deemed my interest distinctly antisocial, and they were right. Buying comic books meant walking 2 miles from my home to a shop in the next town. Wedged between a neon-lit audio store packed with off-brand car stereos and a forlorn florist, it was a narrow, low-ceiling shop full of long, white cardboard boxes of old comic books. The store stank of musty paper, sweat, and wonderful grease from a nearby pizzeria. The owner, a hostile man whose dark hair hung past a drooping mustache, always worked alone. He perched on a stool behind a tall counter that nearly pinned him to an enormous corkboard on the back wall. And on the corkboard were mounted rows of expensive, mysterious old comics with titles like Blood is the Harvest and Phantom Lady. Years later, I would learn that some of these comics were Frankenstein forgeries, a cover from one copy, the interior from another, staples from a third, all meticulously retouched, repaired, and reattached into a saleable whole by that man with the long hair. Next to the owner, flat on the counter, invariably lay a briefcase. And once, When I asked if he wanted help running the store, the owner flipped open the briefcase and pulled out a revolver. He casually pointed the gun at the ceiling tiles above our head, tilted his head and said, "Nah, I've already got a helper." And then he returned the weapon to the briefcase and with an easy smile said, "Tell all your friends." Of course, I didn't tell a soul. I was terrified. But some small, confused bit of my 10-year-old brain was really exhilarated too. To me, comic books were primal. They were about pulp, money, and funky odors, and violence both on the page and in the world. Today, the American commercial comic book has been tamed and brought into the light. Comic book culture is beyond mainstream culture. It is American culture. The New York Times reviews graphic novels. Comic-themed shows proliferate on TV, and $1 billion comic book movie after the next carries bright images of superheroes around the world. Comic books themselves as objects are of secondary importance, financially and culturally, to the films derived from their contents by entertainment behemoths like Disney and Warner Brothers. But these comics, which initially occupied the dark periphery of the New York publishing world, and were often created by poorly paid Jewish American, African American, and Asian American men and women alike, now inform the very heart of that most public, wealthy, and racially oblivious American cultural center, Hollywood. Comic book culture no longer lurks on the periphery. It is at the core of our shared visual vocabulary. The comic book, whether in the form of a collectible vintage title, an action figure, a Halloween costume, a graphic novel, or a film, is the epitome of American popular media at home and abroad. But it was not always so. In the years after World War II, comic books were seen as a virus, a cultural disease that spread among the young, the poor, and the dim. In America, comic books depicted the darkest, most rudimentary expressions of violence, sex, and xenophobia in the national consciousness. And these traits fueled an anti-comic book campaign, anti-comic book legislation, congressional hearings, and eventually a strict, self-imposed censorship code. Internationally, these same comic books showed the world that American society was racist, gruesomely violent, and soaked in sex. Wherever commercial comics traveled at mid-century, they tarnished the image of the United States. They depicted a shadowy culture in which criminals thrived, innocents were murdered, and racism, remarkably, was even more grotesque than newspapers reported in reality. And peppered among these stories were advertisements for bogus medicines, cheap weapons, and vibrators. Together, these contents offered global consumers a brutish image of post-war America, a modern society beset by primitive problems and a complete lack of concern for its young. In 1973, the New York Dolls, a band made up of outer borough immigrants and misfits, released a single called Trash. It is a glorious, catchy swirl of a song. My favorite version, a live version, opens with drummer Jerry Nolan's croaking scream, 1, 2, 3, 4. Half an instant later, singer David Johansen and guitarist Johnny Thunders explode in a chant of trash, go pick it up, as the band bursts into 3 minutes of joyful noise. The lyrics flash image of romance, violence, and doubt. And so many times while writing this book or reading documents, I heard trash in my head. It's so easy to imagine a parent in the early 1950s looking at piles of sexual, violent comics in their child's room and shrieking, "Trash!" just like the New York Dolls. And it is equally easy to imagine that puzzled child looking up at her parent and asking, "Yeah, so?" Of course, comic books are trash. They are art and popular culture and trash all at once. There is no shame in acknowledging them as such. Trash is wonderful. It is free from the expectations and restrictions that weigh down higher culture. It is distinct from garbage culture, though. Both trash culture and garbage culture are designed to provide instantaneous, temporary satisfaction, dopamine hit. But trash culture has value beyond money. It survives. It floats to the top of our popular consciousness. Garbage culture simply sinks. The comic books are not garbage. Trash culture is sticky. Garbage culture is slippery. There is something compelling about trash, something significant beyond the limits imagined by or imposed on its creators. Trash can surprise, Trash can terrify and repel, and trash can enchant. Garbage culture is disposable, but trash culture is ephemeral. It can last a moment, or it can imprint itself for years. More than a decade removed from his childhood, John Gonzalez, a kid from Queens, was inspired by a comic book character to change his name to Johnny Thunders before he picked up a guitar and joined the New York Dolls. Perhaps that comic also pushed him to write an ode to trash and to scream along with David Johansen, "Trash, go pick it up." Describing the comic book as trash takes away none of its substance. And at the mid-20th century, comics were very influential, uniquely American trash. Comics were an indispensable state-sanctioned weapon against fascism and communism, but they were simultaneously considered antisocial, fascist, and stupefying. American comics were so popular after World War II that people across Europe, Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East clamored for issues. And I came across some comics in federal archives that were translated into as many as 24 languages for distribution around the world during the early Cold War. People were clamoring for these comics and they received them. At the same time, though, comics were also nearly invisible. Their ubiquity functioned as camouflage, permitting for a time the distribution in their pages of grotesque and very shocking images. Global consumers demanded so many millions of comics that both readers and critics could find nearly anything they wanted in the resulting flood of culture. They were wonderful, terrible, ephemeral, important trash. And what its critics managed to condemn at the time as hateful garbage is now embraced as entertaining, compelling, and culturally significant. Because my book's a history, I'd also like to talk a bit, besides reading, and explain why I tackled this topic, and why I think it's so important, and what I found. I was talking to my father probably 10 years ago when I was doing graduate work on nuclear weapons history. And I was talking to him, and he told me about growing up in Jersey City in the early 1950s, and the duck and cover drills that he had to do in his school during air raid drills. And of course, my first question was, "You were 10, did you buy any of this, or did you know it was ridiculous?" And he said something I wasn't expecting, which was, "No, I knew it was crap, and my friends knew it was crap." And when I asked him why, he said, "Because we all read comic books." And that answer made no sense to me at the time. So I pushed him, and he said, comics back then were really violent. And they showed a lot of people dying in nuclear attacks. There were no comics that I read that showed people surviving an atomic attack on New York. And I lived right across the river in Jersey City, and I knew I was going to die just like those people in New York. And that really struck me. And it was that conversation that night that caused me to just throw my, the first 4 or 5 years of my graduate education into the bin and start over, trying to study comics and their relationship to US diplomacy and foreign policy. And I went to Washington, D.C., where all the government archives are kept, and almost perfectly unprepared, walked into the National Archives, which is like a terrifyingly imposing building. I got my ID and I went up into the research room. And the second I got there, it hit me that there was not going to be a box marked the US government's secret relationship with the comic book industry. And I had a panic attack and had to be helped out of the building. And I sat in the parking lot and had my bug out and, came back the next day and got to it. But part of the joy of making this book is that there was no box with that label. I had to plow through, I don't even know how many thousands of boxes, many of which had been sealed since they were crated up back in the 1940s and 50s. No one had looked at these since then until I requested them. And the stuff I found in these boxes was amazing. I probably went through 40 boxes before I would find one that was really gold. But when I did, I would just take laps around the table, be like, it's all here. The government's admitting everything that I thought they might be doing, right? It's on the page. This is nuts. And then I would open up another box and find it full of bullwhips and in one case, an unloaded pistol, because critics in the government of comics had sent away for all of the weapons that you could mail order from the back of comics in the late 1940s when they were trying to gather evidence against the comic book industry. And some archivist somewhere put those in a box. And I found them 60 years later. This was a really, really interesting book to write. And the more boxes I opened, the more trails I had to follow. It was really neat that way. But I want to explain what's at the core of the book before I do any more reading. At the core of this book is a very simple idea, which is that comic books are vastly more important than we think. And you can put a period there, but you can also expand that sentence and say, comic books are vastly more important than we think because they have shaped US foreign policy since World War II. And in return, it is the US government that has shaped the American comic book industry since World War II. The stuff that you are watching on screens now, in many cases was created in conjunction with American agents, federal agencies. And a lot of the stuff that you cannot see because the publishers went out of business in the 1950s is because the US government made it its business to put those publishers out of business. And at the core of this involvement between the government and the comic book industry is one issue above all others, and that is race. Virtually everything that I found and that I write about touches on race. The US government got involved with and stayed involved with the comic book industry because of race. And we're going to talk about why now. The comic book industry, as I'm sure a lot of you know, started in the mid-1930s in New York City. And it was, as one artist termed it, a creative sewer. It was where all the people who could not find employment in more legitimate fields found themselves. If you were Jewish, if you were Black, if you were Japanese American or Chinese American, if you were a woman, you were not going to be employed at a magazine like Harper's or the Saturday Evening Post or Life. You were going to find employment in comic books. And from the moment that comic books take off with the publication of Superman #1, really, in 1938, they are exquisitely violent, profoundly racist, and completely uncensored relative to other popular culture. And that's really at the core of a lot of what I'm going to talk about here. At that time, radio had a censorship code. And on top of that, it had tons of high-level advertisers as big as General Motors sponsoring shows or Lucky Strike. They certainly were not going to put up with anything controversial in a radio show. Beginning in, I believe, 1934, Hollywood also is beholden to a censorship code that is extremely strict. It's really comic books alone of the major media that don't have one. And as a result, they can get away with unimaginable extremes of violence and racism and sexuality for the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. These are images that still retain the power to shock. You can trust me on that. There is stuff in these comics that is still really quite disturbing. And what's so remarkable is that this first wave of comics, which is racist, is often made by people who are not white, because that's where they can find work in the comic book industry. They are racist, but made by people of color. They are sexist, but made by women. They are xenophobic, but made by immigrants. And that becomes even more of an issue a year or two later when World War II breaks out. And as soon as it does, and the United States enters the war at the end of 1941, President Roosevelt makes clear that he's going to need a lot of propaganda to support the US war effort. He understands as early as early 1942 that this war is going to take a lot longer than Americans think to win, and that they are going to need to be conditioned to fight this war. And he goes to an organization called his administration goes to an organization called the Writers' War Board, and they tell the board, look, you're staffed by very famous authors of all stripes. It's your job to get together and figure out how to slip propaganda into American culture without anyone noticing that it's propaganda. And the reason for that is they don't want to be compared to fascist governments who wear their propaganda on their sleeve. They don't want massive fascist marches. They don't want anything like that. They want subtle, deniable propaganda. And they want the Writers' War Board to come up with examples of how to do that pronto. And by early 1943, the board decides comics are it. Comics are cheap. Comics are portable. Comics are easy to ship all over the world. Most importantly, comics are comprehensible. You can have a first grade education and still understand a comic because you can just follow along with the pictures. Or you can be a college graduate and you can be completely entertained by the same pages. They love that about comics. And even more important, no one is going to believe for a second that the federal government is in bed with the comic book industry. Comic books are widely known as crap. No one is going to think that the United States government is working with these publishers who are, renowned smut peddlers to put pro-American anti-fascist messages into these comics. The deniability is perfect. So they start working with the Writers' War Board. And the first thing that the government says is, we've been reading your stories and we're really upset because there are some good Germans in these stories. We can't have that. You seem to be drawing a distinction between Germans and Nazis, and there is no distinction between those two. So stop writing about good Germans that are protesting against fascism. Stop writing about good Germans that don't want to serve in the armed forces. They don't exist as far as you're concerned. Every German is a Nazi. Every Nazi is a German. And you have to make clear that they need to be exterminated if we are to have peace in this world. They're not people, they're Nazis, and they all need to go. So cut that out. And there are a lot of Jewish Americans in the comic book industry in New York, many of whom were perfectly happy to produce comic books like that anyway, without any encouragement. And before I started writing this book, I had assumed that's really how propaganda went during World War II. A comic book writer like Joe Simon sat down and came up with Captain America because he was an anti-fascist. I mean, what more could he possibly need? But it's when I went through these archives that I started to realize so much of what I thought was impulsive anti-fascist expression or pro-American expression was actually very, very specifically coordinated by the federal government. And it's remarkable how fine-grained that supervision is. Basically, every major comic book company, except for Marvel, which was then called Timely, participated in this program with the Writers' War Board. And they were told what scripts to write. After they wrote a script for a story, they resubmitted it to the Writers' War Board, who edited it, gave it back to the comic book company, who was then expected to publish it. And the publishers did this because they wanted to support the war, they wanted to appear patriotic, and because the federal government was in charge of paper rationing. And you did not want to get on the bad side of the government if you wanted to keep producing comics. The second thing the Writers' War Board is told is the Japanese characters are different than German characters. We need to kill a lot of Nazis for there to be peace in Europe. But the American people do not understand how serious Japan is as an enemy. The American people continually underestimate the fighting prowess, skill, and determination of Japanese soldiers. And we can't have that because they're going to be outraged when 1944 rolls around and we haven't won. They're going to be outraged when 1945 rolls around and we haven't won. So you need to do something very specific with Japanese characters, and that's make them less than human. And if we catch you trying to do otherwise, as they did with some comic book publishers, we're going to have a problem. You need to treat them as subhuman because American soldiers cannot have any compunction about killing Japanese people. So that's the Writers' War Board's first project. These two very different ways to hate Germans and Japanese combatants and civilians. But what was fascinating for me to learn is that at the same time, the Writers' War Board is being told, use race to build support among the Allies, to build support for the war effort on the home front, and to make sure that there is racial harmony in the United States during the war. So on the one hand, the board is being told, we got to kill them all. And you need to make sure that Americans understand exactly how brutal we have to be about killing them all. And on the other hand, they're being told, look, a lot of Americans do not understand, they lack the sophistication to understand any distinction between Chinese and Japanese people. And we cannot have Chinese people being hated the way Japanese people are being hated because they are our allies. We cannot have Filipinos being hated the same way because we are, you know, the colonizers of their country and are trying to remove the Japanese from it. So the Writers' War Board is treading this crazy tightrope, and they do their best. And they work particularly with a company called DC Comics, and within that, particularly with Superman and even more particularly Wonder Woman, to write these stories about racial tolerance on the home front and America's history of racial understanding, and the fact that the American Constitution guarantees rights for all, and the fact that there are opportunities for people of color in the United States, and that they are contributing to the war effort. And they do this with varying degrees of success. I found a document written by the head of the Writers' War Board who said, I brought some of these Wonder Woman comics home to my kids, and they didn't understand the first thing about it. At the end, they were pretty sure they were supposed to hate everyone in it. So I'm not sure these things are working, but it didn't matter. There was no plan B. So the government pressed forward with this. And I think they did, unsurprisingly, a more effective job at promoting hatred than at promoting tolerance. And I want to stress, when the board was told to promote tolerance and to promote racial comity at home, it was done for one reason only: to keep things calm so that war production was not disturbed. That is it. There was no higher calling. There was no understanding that this was going to be the start of a civil rights movement. None of that. This was for one practical purpose only, and it was to be done in a way that did not offend Southern lawmakers in any way, that was not going to offend Southern soldiers in any way, that was not going to make any white soldier do something that they were uncomfortable with. So it was really bounded, really modest, and really focused only on making sure that there were no strikes, that there were no lynchings at factories, that there were no anything that was going to cause problems about war production. So the end of the war rolls around, and what do we have now? We have a comic book industry that has been endorsed by the government and that has grown enormously, that is now selling hundreds of millions of issues every year, because the government, in addition to, futzing with the contents of comics, is shipping millions of them every month all over the world to soldiers, airmen, Marines, you name it. They're getting these comics for free. These comics are also being sold on bases. World War II was the best possible thing that could have happened as far as the comic book industry was concerned, because now they were viewed as patriotic instead of smut peddlers. They were cooperating with the government, so they were getting all the paper they wanted. And their audience was being enlarged to a degree that they could not possibly have imagined in 1939 or 1940. Suddenly, there are tens of millions of service members reading comics, and they are everywhere. It was fascinating to read letters to the editor from wartime comics, because one would be from the pilot of a B-26 bomber who would say, I love your comics, but my co-pilot keeps taking them, and by the time a mission's over, they're with the tail gunner. Like they're all over the plane. Or someone on a ship would say, you have to send more copies because I get one from my mother, but it's destroyed within 2 days because everyone passes it around the bunks. I need more. Can you please send 50 copies of whatever it was to the ship? There's letters from priests saying, I find these comic books have a soothing effect on service members in my flock. Would you please send more to me so that I can distribute them? So the comic book industry goes from a success before World War II, but a sort of, modest success, into an absolute cultural behemoth by 1945. And it's more than just a behemoth. It is a state-sanctioned, state-protected, state-shaped behemoth. These comic book makers are producing with the government's explicit blessing. I mean, it's almost difficult to imagine now how good those comic book publishers must have felt in 1945. They are on top of the world. They can't make enough of these. They're selling so fast. And the other thing that's happening is anytime an American soldier in the Solomon Islands in the Pacific reads a comic, eventually he or one of his buddies is going to drop it. Anytime someone in France after D-Day is reading a comic, eventually they're going to drop it. And what happens is comics become this virus that critics will later worry about. They're creating audiences all over the world. It's not just Americans at home, and it's not just Americans in the service that are reading comics now. They are creating tens of millions of new customers and new readers all over the world simply by pollinating, by dropping, by leaving behind, by gifting to that 6-year-old that's running behind your Jeep, by giving them to the Frenchman that you see over there, sitting sad in front of a bookstore, by trading them for smokes, whatever it was. So it's not even just that the American comic book industry is a colossus in 1945. It is that it is sowing the seeds of even more growth after the war. But all this is happening in a very specific circumstance, which is under the aegis of the federal government. The federal government is to some extent tamping down on all of this. There's a lot of success, but the government is still in control. It controls the paper. It controls a lot of the content. And then in 1945, what happens? The government says, we're all set. That was great. Thanks for helping. See you never. And in 1946, this industry finds itself unleashed. It has no censorship code. It has no responsibility to any outside observer. It has all the paper it wants. It has a brand new audience, hundreds of millions of people bigger than in 1939 because of people in the service who got hooked on comics. And it has all kinds of adult content ready to give these new readers who are, 18 to 25, the age of service members. And on top of that, these service members are about to be sent all over the world again as part of America's Cold War imperialism. So they are going to, again, re-sow those fields with new potential readers. And by the early 1950s, by the late 1940s, after the federal government has taken its hand off of the comic book industry, there are no less than 650 titles available for sale in the United States. And combined, they're selling over 1 billion titles a year. That absolutely dwarfs the circulation numbers of any magazine that you care to mention from the late 1940s. Dwarfs. And they've just spent 4 years spewing state-sanctioned hate. And now they're being written and illustrated by people who engaged in combat, who read these comics for 4 years, who were deeply scarred by what they saw, who are going to try and express what they saw through their artwork. That is where we find the American comic book industry in the late 1940s. And new genres replace superheroes. Superheroes are passé by 1948. Their sales numbers plummet. And in their place come crime, horror, and romance comics. And like all the other comics that came before them, they are not censored. And these crime and horror and romance comics are pretty shockingly explicit. Even today. And they rapidly become equally as popular as superhero comics ever were, maybe more so. Titles like Crime Does Not Pay, which was kind of the archetypal crime comic book, was selling anywhere from 2 to 5 million copies a month of a comic book about crime that had people being machine gunned to death or electrocuted or raped every few pages. I still remember coming across the cover of one in the Library of Congress, which depicted 4 grown men in a car outside an elementary school, luring probably a 6-year-old girl into the car with an ice cream cone. And all of the men in the car are carrying weapons and leering at this little girl. And the implications are horrific and uncomplicated. And the contents of comics like that, we're not shy about showing you exactly what they were. And as a result, an anti-comic book campaign starts. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this, and you've read about Dr. Frederick Wertham and the other comic book opponents. What I did not know until I wrote this book was that Dr. Wertham was very strongly encouraged by local, state, and federal politicians. His campaign was not some grassroots effort that was fueled by his own rage and, concerned moms and frustrated people. It was a fairly concerted effort, coordinated at 3 levels of government, to make sure that the comic book industry was tamed. And he, as well as other comic book opponents, received money, received guidance, received political cover, received all kinds of support. And that in and of itself was interesting to me, because it culminates in 1954 with a Senate subcommittee hearing that essentially destroys the comic book industry. And again, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this. What you may not have read about, and that I did not know about until I read the full transcripts of these hearings and went through all of the preparatory records for them, is that there were multiple speeches given by US ambassadors from a variety of countries in the decolonizing world saying, these comics are making my job impossible. You cannot let these things into this country. In one case, I remember particularly India. You can't let these things in. They show people of color as animals. And the ambassador to India, it's like, I read one of these things and it has people that look like Indians eating each other. You can't seriously expect me to keep relations smooth when 10,000 of these are coming into the country every month. It's not possible. It has to stop. And ambassador after ambassador is giving testimony like this. Propagandists from the State Department are saying, this is a nightmare. Every time we go to France to talk about X, Y, and Z, all they want to do is yell at us about comic books because they're racist, because they're turning French kids racist, because they're violent, and they're turning French kids into criminals. And that ended up being a very big part of the 1954 subcommittee hearings. I had not heard about that before I started to write this book, nor had I thought about the fact that the US had a vested interest in crushing these comic books at the source, because they were causing no end of diplomatic crises for the United States when it was trying to present itself as this more sophisticated, gentle, like humanitarian alternative to Soviet-style communism. And instead, what do? You get 5,000 comic books every week about rape and violence and murder and anything else that you could find in a post-war comic book, which was virtually anything. And okay, here's where we get back to the theme of World War II and the government's appropriation, though. And this is what really melted my brain. One part of the government, the legislative branch, Congress, is investigating the comic book industry and saying, we can't have it. We cannot have it. You're making us look like a bunch of animals when we're trying to present ourselves as sophisticates. But at the same time that the legislative branch is doing that, the State Department is saying, hold on a minute. People seem to really like these things, and they seem to really absorb the messages. If you guys are telling us that people in France or people in Atlanta or people in New York are reading these crime and horror comics and then acting on them, being affected by them, turning into juvenile delinquents, being criminalized by these, then what if we put stuff that we like in them? It seems to us that people will act the way we want them to act then. That comic books, in a sense, are the perfect propaganda vehicle because anyone can understand them because you don't even have to know how to read. Everyone seems to like them. And because they're cheap. And the third part that the State Department particularly loved was they're totally deniable. You don't have to sign a comic book. You don't have to say property of the United States State Department on it. It can just be blank on the back. So they could get ideas around the world without them being attributed to the United States. And the first thing these State Department propagandists do is exactly what the Writers' War Board propagandists do during World War II, which is to say, this is how we shape popular views of race. This is how we do it. And just as in during World War II, and I want to be very, very clear about this, their motives, their understanding, their perception were all racist. There is no other way to describe the justification that the State Department puts forward for using these comics to shape popular perceptions of race. What they decide is that people of color, and particularly in the decolonizing world, are simply not intelligent enough to understand American books or even American movies. And even if they could understand American books and movies, how are you going to get them to these people? They don't live anywhere navigable. They live up in mountains. They live in ravines, wherever the United States propagandists imagine these people living. We don't want to carry heavy projectors there. We don't want to carry 10-pound books there. Comics, they're light, they're flat, airdrop them. It's easy. Or if you don't want to airdrop them, one ingenious way they came up with was give them to priests. Give them to priests in every village. Priests will put them in the hymnals and they can carry them out. Give them to people who bag your groceries. They'll stuff one in every bag. The people at the State Department, whatever their motives, were almost infinitely clever in figuring out how to distribute these. But I do want to stress that their motivations for this and their explanations for this were completely racist. So beginning in the early 1950s, the State Department says, all right, let's get back to work. We have some track record of federal agencies doing this during World War II. Should we just copy what they did? And interestingly, they decide, no. During World War II, it was commercial comics that had these propaganda messages put in them. Superman, Captain America, whatever it was a comic you bought. The State Department decides in the early 1950s, we don't want to do that because these comics are just awful. Like the stuff that you can get now, it's just a nightmare. We can't touch it. We'll make our own. So they put together teams of writers and artists, and they basically fund the creation of a fascinating company in Washington, D.C. called Commercial Comics. Very mundane title, run by a very bland businessman from New York who moved down to D.C. And what Commercial Comics becomes is the quasi-official outlet for American comic book propaganda. The government comes up with an idea, they ship it to Commercial Comics. Commercial Comics whips up a batch of test comics, sends it back to the State Department, and they work on it back and forth. And they very quickly realize something even cooler about comics as a means of propaganda during the Cold War, which is you can make them in like 50 languages, no sweat, because all you have to do is erase the contents of a thought bubble or a speech bubble and put a different language in. So Commercial Comics and the State Department are now even more excited about this. And this campaign takes off very, very quickly. And tens and then hundreds of millions of comics are spread, particularly throughout the decolonizing world. And again, there's a racist or race-based explanation for this. The State Department is mortified at the idea that white Europeans will ever see state-sanctioned American propaganda comic books. They're fine giving modern art, modern dance, modern music. They're fine with Western and Northern European people seeing Jackson Pollock or Martha Graham or whatever, the Eames come up with in terms of furniture, but they cannot be shown comic books. It's just too embarrassing. So the federal propaganda effort during the Cold War is overwhelmingly in the decolonizing world and is overwhelmingly anti-communist. It's designed to show why you shouldn't go the Soviet way and why the American way is better. And that all made some sense to me. But then I started seeing references to CIA comics, and comics dropped over Cuba during something called Operation Mongoose, which was a Kennedy brothers planned effort to overthrow Fidel Castro. I found a reference to that in passing in a document talking about how, well, Mongoose starts on this day, and day 3, all the comics get dropped, and day 4, this happens. It's like, whoa, okay, I have to find out more about this. And what came to light fairly well, not that quickly, actually. What came to light eventually was that the CIA was also making its own comic books. And I tried for 2 years to use the Freedom of Information Act to get the CIA to cough up those comic books, and I couldn't do it. Someone more skilled than myself will have to. I really want to see them. The one thing I found was in the records for the CIA's 1954 overthrow of the Guatemalan government was what they termed a murder manual. And there's a picture of it in the book. It's basically a very crude comic book drawn over one page, teaching the reader how to enter a room, machine gun the occupants, and then throw them out a window so that the machine gun holes, the bullet holes will be less evident because their bodies have plummeted to the ground. And that certainly whet my appetite for trying to find more CIA comics. I'm only sorry, sorry that I couldn't. And that's really what happens with the US government until about 1954, pardon me, 1964, 65. And I noticed that the record started to sputter out around then. And, I chewed on it for a while. I don't have an official explanation, but my suspicion is that by the mid-1960s, it's very hard for the United States to spread lighthearted anti-communist propaganda about the benevolence of capitalism and US-style democracy when it is on the verge of and starting to annihilate the entire country of Vietnam, North and South. And I think it's very difficult for propagandists at the State Department to convince people that that is still a message that can be convincingly conveyed. That is my suspicion / belief. I hope that someone does work on propaganda comics post 64, 65 and can tell us, officially. But there's really no end to this story because there are still propaganda comics being made with the cooperation now of corporations mostly rather than the federal government. And there are still comic book movies being made that use characters and beliefs that were created during World War II and the Cold War, often with the hand of the government behind them. And I feel like it's not discussed publicly. And it really needs to be, because these comics have now become our global ambassadors. There is nothing associated more with the United States globally than the comic book movie. They are successful beyond what any other franchise or type has ever been. And the fact that they're out there without frank discussion of their origins, without frank discussion of the purposes behind these characters, or the reasons they look the way they do, or the reasons they act the way they do, is deeply problematic to me. And I'm going to read a little bit from the book talking about that. In their time, comic books were considered ephemeral objects to read and throw aside. Printed on high-acid paper that fades and disintegrates, comic books are fragile things. Nobody imagined that they would be a rich resource for future scholars. My father used to tell the story of Mr. Bieber, an Austrian man who owned a used bookstore in Jersey City. Although my father had to put up with Mr. Bieber's flagrant anti-Semitism and grime at Mr. Bieber's store, he viewed these as minor problems because Mr. Bieber sold old issues of Wonder Woman and Mighty Mouse. And the bookseller did so because he believed in the importance of these comics. Mr. Bieber acquired a huge collection of comics of his own. And when he died in the late 1950s, Mrs. Bieber tried to donate her husband's trove, easily the largest private comic book collection in the country, to the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian passed, having concluded that comic books were unimportant, that they were trash. Who knows how many millions of comics have disappeared like those that belonged to Mr. Bieber. But still, 20th century comics exists as ghosts among us. The excitement, the trauma, the rage generated by the swirl of uncensored American comics, these are not dead. Contemporary global perceptions of the United States are an assembly of old and new. They emerge from memory as much as experience. And the cultural impression left by billions of uncensored comic books continue to do cultural work at home and abroad. The 20th century comic book is still a sticky cultural object, powerful, compelling trash that attracts, repels, and fascinates us. Characters conceived to fight World War II and the Cold War now dominate American and global popular visual culture. And now, as during those earlier times, they operate with the implied consent of the US government. Characters in these billion-dollar movies represent the United States around the world, and these films work to shape international understanding of our nation's fears, policy goals, and self-image. At the same time, these characters and movies offer clues as to how the United States views the rest of the world. While now supplied on film instead of on pulp, comic book narratives remain imperial, political media. These are the phantoms swirling around us still, shaping our popular culture in ways we cannot single out because their prevalence feels so familiar. We live within the Pulp Empire and are accustomed to the almost oppressive presence of comic books in our popular culture. Even harder to identify are the reverberations of thousands of men and women who produced 1 billion comic books a year during the industry's heyday. We occupy a world shaped by the remarkable characters they created, some of which survive into the present day. The ghosts of that dead industry are everywhere. They affect all of us who participate in American culture. This is the legacy of men and women who were not reasonably rewarded in life, but who in death are the unsung kings and queens of Hollywood. It was not always this way. In the wake of World War II, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, the co-creators of Captain America, bought houses in the same suburb on Long Island, New York. The two men kept odd work hours, and their new neighbors began muttering about how Simon and Kirby earned their money. The men either had to be mobsters or bookies, as they never seemed to go outside during the daytime and worked only at night. Simon and Kirby decided to let their neighbors believe that they were bookies, as it was more prestigious than being known as comic book artists. In the late 1940s, working in the comic book industry was a shameful thing, even for artists as skilled and successful as Simon and Kirby. Those on the margins of the industry and American society were much less fortunate. These were the men and women immortalized by Hank Williams during the late 1940s, the people that did not benefit from the great post-war boom, the people that were not allowed to achieve because of religion, color, or sexuality. They were the poor kids like Elvis Presley, who grew up reading borrowed copies of Captain Marvel Jr. and based his entire stage persona on his comic book hero. They were men like the World War II veteran of combat and atomic testing at Bikini Atoll, who, upon returning to a very different United States, told the reporter, "The only thing I have in common with my son is the comic books." These men and women, too, are ghosts in our cultural machine. Today, comic books offer us an entirely new means of interpreting the 20th century and our current popular culture. Comics provide fresh insights into American diplomacy, cultural imperialism, and our self-image. We can now embrace the American comic for what it is, a wonderful and powerful means to better understand the connections among policy, race, and culture. Can I read one other quick thing, or are we done?
Oh, please. Yeah, please,
okay.
please. And there's a couple of things I want to mention too when you're done.
Sure. In the course of researching this book, I discovered many documents that refer to CIA comic books. Some were likely used in the early 1960s, primarily in Latin America. Others seem to have been used in preparation for America's 1984 invasion of Grenada and the Nicaraguan Revolution. So far, my efforts to compel the agency to make these documents public have been unsuccessful. We will gain access to them someday, and they will enrich our understanding of how and why the government appropriated something as pedestrian as the comic to gain advantage in the Cold War. Early on in this project, I spent many months trying to track down Malcolm Ader's surviving family. Malcolm Ader was the head of commercial comics, who made virtually all of the government's propaganda comics for them. I scoured newspapers, searching for Ader's obituary and some mention of wife or children. I found obituaries for dozens of men named Malcolm Ader, and I sent letters to all of their survivors that I could find. And after nearly a year, I received a response from a man who said he was the son of the Malcolm Ader who had owned Commercial Comics. He was happy to talk to me, and he would bring along his elderly mother. And while we spoke, Mrs. Ader, his mother, told me that her husband had worked hand in hand with a variety of federal agencies, including the CIA. She and her son then told me an incredible tale. They said that the CIA contacted Malcolm Ader in the early 1980s to make an anti-communist comic book about the new Marxist government on the Caribbean island of Grenada. They were sure it was not the first time the agency reached out to him. Indeed, Ader and the CIA had an established routine, his wife told me. Whenever the agency needed a run of special comics, Ader would drive to DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., and stand on the sidewalk until a car driven by CIA employees pulled up. Once Ader entered the car, it drove in endless loops around DuPont Circle. The employees told Ader what sort of comic they wanted, what language to use, and when they needed it. They then handed him a bag of cash and let him out. Once the comic was finished, Ader would return to DuPont Circle, and in the car, again, he would hand over proofs for CIA approval. And after he received the go-ahead, he would print the comics and deliver the copies to the CIA. The most thrilling part of this story is that it reads like something out of a comic. I'll stop there, but thank you so much for listening. I hope you have some questions.
You know, it's while we're waiting, most people are aware of the Howell trial, but there were two additional trials, and one of them was for Lenore Kendall's Pillow Book. But the third trial was for Zap Comics.
I didn't know that.
And that was thrown out of court as well. So just a little side note. While we're waiting for questions, shall I share some images? And maybe we can do this fun thing, do word association. I will show an image, and maybe we can start with the cover, because I want to talk to you about the cover. Let's see if I can drag us over. Here we go. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Good. So who worked on this?
I suggested that image for the cover.
Oh, you did? Oh, fantastic.
Yes. So the comic book censorship code was implemented in late 1954. From the end of World War II through 1954, there was a subgenre of comics that I'm fascinated by called injury to the eye motif. And this is one of those.
It's incredible. I mean, it really harkens to that EC Comics, that really garish, like nasty horror.
I think this one is from a comic called Mr. Mystery.
Mr. Mystery.
I think it's number 12.
Yeah.
But yeah, that one really struck me, and I'm glad they used it.
Yeah, it's very compelling. So
this is a cover that when I found definitely propelled me to learn more about cooperation between the Writers' War Board and these companies.
And of course, here we are using sex as a weapon.
Implied rape and sex, yes. Another example of how comic book publishers were only too happy to help the war effort, and I don't think just cynically. I think genuine patriotism was behind it as well. But there were benefits to them, and I'm sure DC was only too happy to lend out Superman for posters like these. Yeah, I mean that is what it is. If I can give a quick anecdote, there was some concern in the Writers' War Board papers that how do you incorporate Superman into propaganda because he can beat everyone, but we don't want people to think that that Japanese soldiers and German soldiers are easy to beat. So how do we design comics that involve him in the war effort like a patriot, but don't involve him ending the war in 15 minutes like he could. So do we have August, September, but no year date on this? I'm wondering what year it is, because that is exactly the kind of image that would not have pleased the Writers' War Board. That's the kind of broad comedy that they really did not care for.
Mm.
So an extremely powerful example of what the board pushed publishers to do, to animalize Japanese soldiers. I should point out again, though, that as far as I can tell, and I've done a lot of reading, Marvel did not participate in the Writers' War Board's program for comic book propaganda. So this is probably an example of self-motivated racism and patriotism. So down here at the bottom of that is a character called the Claw, who kind of personified the Yellow Menace in comic books during World War II. The Claw could grow to any size at will. He commanded a vast subterranean army of indeterminate Asian subjects. He invaded America on more than one occasion, and he looked like that. Kind of a traditional wartime image there. This is of real significance to me personally, because it's comics like this that my father was talking about when he first sparked this book. When he said, I read lots of comics with atomic imagery in them, and it didn't look like anyone was surviving in those. Atomic War was a 4-issue, there you go, a 4-issue series that is pretty blunt.
And we come back to the beautiful cover, which I'm hoping everyone, we have posted links in the chat with which you may purchase this lovely book.
Okay.
But I'm a little curious about your methodology when you were going in to do your research.
Sure.
You know, because I totally understand being overwhelmed that first time and just realizing, wow, where do you even start? And so, you know, how did you build that method to get to this data?
I inadvertently met a senior archivist who, like, one of the most serious people I've ever met. And I told him what I needed. And he said, it's people like you that drive me crazy, because you want stuff, but you don't understand the institutional structure of the federal government. And until you understand the institutional structure of the federal government, I can't help you. So you need to sit down and make a flow chart. And when you understand what agencies were responsible for like whatever you're looking at, then I will help you. But I can't until then. So I did my best to do what he said. And I ended up just having to go through hundreds of boxes for various agencies that had some affiliation with propaganda arms of the government. And, you know, 70% of them were a bust, but they were still interesting. And then the remaining 30 kind of put me in new directions and to different agencies. And I expanded my flow chart.
Let's see. It looks like we've got some coming through. So Rick says, was there any anti-war comic scene happening concurrently to World War II?
That's a great question. So there were, I mean, I'm not sure exactly, but let's say tens of millions of comics being published every month. And I don't know what percentage survived. And of that, I don't know what percentage I read, but the Library of Congress has many, many hundreds of thousands. And I read as many as I could of their World War II comics. So my response is based on the fact that I only have a grasp on a single-digit percentage of what was published. But my answer is a resounding no. I saw none of that. And in fact, there was one story. I remember this. Yes, towards the end of the war, DC and Fawcett, I believe, started proposing stories to the Writers' War Board about the end of the war, about what was going to happen about in the world afterwards, about what peace was going to bring, about what a world without war was going to look like. And in both cases, were shut down without any explanation beyond there. Basically, there are still people to kill, and we have no interest in speculating about what the post-war is going to look like. The only thing you're allowed to put in your stories is that for there to be a post-war, we have to kill a lot of people first. And then once we do that, we can start talking about what the world is going to look like. So I found at least those two examples of the opposite, but I did not really find anything anti-war, no. And it's a fascinating question because this is a vast and complex country, and it was a vast and complex industry, and you'd think there would have been room for that. I just didn't personally find it. Thank you, though. Oh, Peter? Sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I got muted. Thanks. So Kevin asks or comments, beautiful presentation. Thank you. We used to live in North Beach, but now in Pasadena. We just bought the book from City Lights. Thank you.
Thank you.
Comic book fan and historian for my whole life, but never knew about the government involvement. My wife, Christy, is blown away. What about the Kennedy era and the whole White House then with Cuba, etc.?
First of all, Kevin, thank you for getting the book and for your kind words. And that's a great question. I didn't touch on it in the talk. My answer to your question is going to be my best guess based on what I found. So in 1954, the censorship code basically chops the head off of the comic book industry. Very few companies survive. A lot of those that do are swallowed up by the behemoths like Dell and DC. And Marvel at that point is doing okay, but is not, the cultural titan it is now. But you're quite right. During the Kennedy administration, they come out with their new wave of superheroes. Fantastic Four, Iron Man, Captain America is brought back, and Nick Fury and S.H.I.E.L.D. I have a theory about this. You can tell me what you think of it. I think that the people who ran Timely and then Marvel saw what happened in 1954 and understood you don't mess with the government. If you step over the line and start interfering with winning the Cold War, they're going to step on you hard. So what if we played ball? What if we weaponized humanity in the form of Iron Man, but made him a hyper patriot? What if we sent Nick Fury to Latin America to overthrow governments with the CIA? What if Captain America is, what he is I think he's even billed as Captain America Commie Smasher for a little while, but that's in the 50s. Basically, everyone in the new Marvel universe is a Cold Warrior, with maybe the exception of Spider-Man. I don't know. And so I think this is what I think. I think Marvel did that for more than one reason. I think they did it primarily because it was straightforward and uncomplicated and popular. But I also do think that that's a reverberation of everything that happened in the early 1950s and the fact that everyone at Marvel remembered what happened to the rest of that industry, and that, there was some room for deviation and there was a little room for questioning, but that it was a lot easier to go along with what the Kennedy administration was pushing than it was to fight against it. And, is it Captain America? Yes, Captain America goes to Vietnam early. There's an amazing Thor issue. Is it 117? I can't remember. Journey into Mystery. Thor goes to North Korea, and it's just like, I'm going to clean this up. So I feel like the degree to which Marvel goes along with the zeitgeist is almost suspicious to me, and it makes me think that they have some institutional memory of the way it could have been. But that's my best guess.
It's interesting how far we've come too, just to see kind of this arc of evolution and how characters like the Joker have been, turned into protagonists. And, Robert Downey Jr. just announced, or was announced, who the new Doctor Doom is going to be. And it was, unveiled as Robert Downey Jr. And of course, he was basking in being this villain. And of course, people were applauding and giving him a standing ovation. And I think that's really fascinating how we've now come to being a place that sort of, kind of glorifies villainy. And yet that's something that sort of has always been there. It's just a little more in the open now.
The villains are often more interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, Kevin, if it's okay, I'm going to back up for one sec. One other thing we didn't touch on, but there were a not insignificant number of communists in the comic book industry from its inception through, well, I don't know when they left, but they got they got blamed in the early 1950s, and that was part of why the censorship code came down. But the publisher Lev Gleason, who published Crime Does Not Pay and ran Lev Gleason Publications, which was an enormously successful and popular comic book, was, as far as I'm concerned, a party member. I've read his FBI file. It's pretty redacted, but it's not, I don't think it's too ambiguous. So I also think that people at Marvel remembered that this was an industry that looked very anti-American to a lot of people peering in from outside, and that it was in everyone's best interest to not look that way, to not be Lev Gleason, to not be publishing this stuff, to not be talking about fair pay for your artists and your writers as he used to not be writing anti-American editorials as he did in one of the newspapers he owned. So that's just something I thought of. I'll stop there.
Yeah. A big shout out to Patrick Hughes from Pluto Press is in the audience tonight. He's got some comments. Great talk. I see there is a copy of Grenada 1 for sale for $500 on eBay. Are commercial comics hard to find today?
Okay. Patrick, are you on eBay right now? Sorry, you can't answer. I bet it's Malcolm Ader's son selling that. When I went to interview him and his mother, his garage was packed full, and people have told me that he's an active presence on eBay. My suggestion would be to look at the comic book archive at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, UNL. It's run by a man named Richard Graham, and it specializes in, how do I put it? It specializes in like non-commercial comic books produced by states and the federal government. So not necessarily propaganda, but not commercial comic books. And I am 99.9% sure that they have a copy of that Grenada comic scanned and available for download. So that's the comic book archive at University of Nebraska, Lincoln.
Yeah. And then Patrick also asks, can you speak about Walt Disney's role in propaganda efforts?
Oh, I'd like to speak more about it. I know about Disney from the perspective of research in the archives, and the OIAA, which was the Organization for Inter-American Affairs, was created during World War II to coordinate goodwill between the United States and Central and South America. In the papers for that, I saw a lot of references to Disney movies that were being made for and shipped south. But I haven't come across any Disney comic books produced under the aegis of the writers, under the aegis of the government during the war. And you're kind of blowing my mind with that question because I've never actually chewed on it before. How did a company that big get away with not playing ball? Unless they were just so helpful through their movies that nothing was expected of them in their comics. The answer is no, with an addendum, which is, I seem to remember a document where Disney did say, we don't really want to be involved with, we don't really want Mickey Mouse comics to be part of this. We're happy to do movies, but not anything on paper. And thank you for asking that, because now I have a whole new avenue to look at. And there's a really good book on it. Is it called The Mouse Goes South? I'll look it up in a second, about the Organization for Inter-American Affairs and Disney during World War II.
Well, we have come to the top of the hour. Dr. Paul Hirsch, thank you for joining us tonight, and congratulations on such a compelling and fascinating book.
Thank you so much. This was a joy. Thanks for your questions and for listening.